Today we pull back the curtain on Amy Archer-Gilligan, a church-going widow with a warm smile and a nursing home that locals would come to call the murder factory. In a quiet Connecticut town, residents walked in healthy and left in caskets, their fortunes conveniently funneled to Amy. But one grieving sister, armed with a suspicious letter and unshakable determination, dared to ask, why are so many people dying in Amy's care? And why did they all seem to enrich her on the way out? This isn't just an ordinary story. It's a descent into greed, deception, and a trust so deeply betrayed it changed a community forever. But before we get into that story, if you like your true crime brief and bingeable, you found the right podcast. I give you at least 2 episodes per week, so hit that follow button now, and welcome to 10-Minute Murder. In the suffocating heat of a Connecticut summer in 1916, a determined woman sat across the desk from a man she hoped could deliver justice. Nellie Pierce clutched a worn envelope, her brother's name scrawled in a familiar hand, and a slim stack of papers filled with grim accusations. Her voice, though trembling, cut through the room like a blade. Someone had murdered her brother, and she believed she knew exactly who it was. Nellie had tried before. She presented her case to the district attorney, who dismissed her with a smirk and a condescending pat on the shoulder. Now she pinned her last hope on the editor of the Hartford Courant. If the law wouldn't listen, maybe the press would. Maybe the truth about Amy Archer-Gilligan would finally see the light of day. Amy Archer-Gilligan, kindly, church-going Amy, was no ordinary suspect. In the genteel community of Windsor, Connecticut, Amy was a picture of piety, a plump, middle-aged widow with a generous smile and a reputation for helping the needy. But Nellie was convinced that beneath her unassuming exterior lay something monstrous, a predator hiding in plain sight. Amy's story began far from the whispers of suspicion that now swirled around her. Born on Halloween in 1873, Amy Duggan was the 8th of 10 children. She grew up in a modest home, did well enough in school, and seemed to avoid the threats of madness that plagued some of her siblings. Her life unfolded quietly, without much to suggest the darkness that would later come to define her. By the dawn of the 20th century, Amy had married, given birth to a daughter, and found her calling. In 1901, she and her husband were hired as live-in caretakers for the elderly John Seymour in Newington, Connecticut. After Seymour's death 3 years later, the couple remained in the home, transforming it into a business, Sister Amy's Nursing Home for the Elderly. It was here that Amy's story truly began to curdle, though no one suspected it yet. As the name suggested, Amy, her husband James, and their young daughter Mary were asked to stay on as managers of the new nursing home. What might seem like a modest endeavor today was, at the time, a groundbreaking move. The Archers were, in many ways, pioneers in elder care. In the early 1900s, care homes, as we know them, didn't exist. The responsibility for aging relatives typically fell to younger family members, with generations living under one roof and sharing the burden of care. But societal shifts at the turn of the century began to upend this tradition. Younger generations, particularly in rural America, moved to bustling cities, lured by the promise of jobs, culture, and opportunity. While that migration spurred economic growth and shaped the modern United States, it left behind a critical void. Elderly patients and grandparents were often abandoned, with no one left to care for them in their twilight years. This new reality created a niche for families like the Archers. They filled the gap by running facilities designed to house and care for the aging population. However, with little regulation or oversight to ensure patient well-being, these homes often operated in a gray area, one ripe for exploitation. It's no surprise, then, that Sister Amy's Nursing Home for the Elderly thrived. When the owners of the original house decided to sell a few years later, the Archers used their earnings to strike it out on their own. Moving to Windsor, Connecticut, they launched a new facility, the Archer Home for the Elderly and Infirm. The model was simple. Boarders could pay between $7 and $25 weekly, or opt into a one-time life care payment of $1,000, a sum equivalent to about $26,000 today. For many in Windsor, it seemed like a bargain. For the Archers, it was a lucrative business model. But beneath the polished surface, not everything was as it seemed. Complaints from the residents and family began to mount. 3 years after the opening, the Archers faced a lawsuit from the McClintock family, who accused them of neglecting a relative in their care. The matter was quietly settled out of court, with the Archers paying a hefty sum, $5,000, about $133,000 in today's money. For the McClintocks, the settlement may have closed one dark chapter, but for the other residents of the Archer home, the horror was only beginning. It began, as many dark tales do, with death. In 1910, the Archer household fell into mourning. James Archer's sudden death left behind his 12-year-old daughter Mary and his widow, Amy, who now had to manage both the care of the home and their mounting debts. Bills came quickly. Mary's private school tuition, back taxes from the previous year, and Amy, now wary and alone, scrutinized every expense. But it wasn't enough. The Archer home for the elderly and infirm teetered on the edge of financial collapse. Yet, in her grief, Amy found a lifeline. Weeks before his death, James had taken out a life insurance policy. The policy paid out swiftly, providing the funds to cover their debts and to keep the care home running. For the next 3 years, Amy managed the business, ensuring Mary's education continued and maintaining a facade of normalcy. In 1913, Michael W. Gilligan entered her life. A wealthy widower, Michael seemed to offer Amy the stability and support that she wanted and needed. Their marriage was swift, but tragedy struck again. Imagine that. Just 3 months later, Michael suddenly died from what was officially ruled a heart failure. His funeral was quick, but unsettling questions lingered. Before his death, Michael had rewritten his will, leaving everything to Amy and bypassing his 4 sons. Though they contested it, the will held up in court, and Amy inherited his entire fortune. With her wealth secured, Amy poured resources into the care home. For some residents, life continued comfortably. For others, however, Michael's death marked the start of a far darker chapter at the Archer home. For many residents of the Archer home for the elderly and infirm, walking in on their own 2 feet didn't guarantee they wouldn't leave in a casket. Even those who seemed healthy and vibrant often met sudden, mysterious ends. Take Franklin R. Andrews, for instance. Franklin wasn't even a resident. He was a handyman who helped with odd jobs around the property. On May 29, 1914, he spent the day painting a fence in the warm Connecticut sun. When his work was done, he stepped back inside, only to collapse hours later and die. The official cause of death was listed as a stomach ulcer, but Franklin's family wasn't convinced. Their suspicions grew when his sister, Nellie Pierce, found a troubling letter among his belongings. It was a demand for a large sum of money, signed by none other than Amy Archer-Gilligan herself. That letter spurred Nellie into action, digging into Amy's past and her home's history. Nellie uncovered a horrifying pattern. Franklin's death wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a grim trend. Numerous residents had died after giving Amy significant amounts of money. Between 1911 and 1916, 48 patients had died in her care. And I know what you're thinking. At first, that number doesn't seem shocking for a facility catering to the elderly. But a closer look proved damning. The Jefferson Street home in Hartford, a comparable care home operating at the same time, reported similar death totals with 7 times as many residents. The numbers left little doubt. Staying at Amy's home was a death sentence. Nellie's investigation also revealed that many deceased residents had paid Amy large sums of money before their untimely deaths, often through life care plans that transferred their entire savings to her. Tragically, most didn't live long enough to benefit from the care that they'd paid for. Armed with this evidence, Nellie went to the district attorney. But the DA wasn't swayed. He reviewed the figures, read the letter, and looked at Amy herself. She hardly fit the image of a murderer. Twice widowed, single mother, and a respected community figure. Amy was small, soft-spoken and devout. She never missed church, had paid for a stained glass window at the local chapel, and seemed tirelessly devoted to the elderly and her daughter's education. To him, the claims seemed baseless. Amy was above suspicion. He dismissed Nellie outright, but Nellie wasn't done. Desperate to expose the truth, she turned to the local press, determined to uncover the horrors lurking behind the Archer home's walls. The Hartford Courant took notice of the alarming number of deaths at Amy's home, branding it with a chilling new nickname, the Murder Factory. A series of damning articles brought fresh attention to the case, and the resulting public pressure forced the authorities to act. Police launched an investigation and exhumed 5 bodies, including Franklin Andrews and Amy's second husband, Michael Gilligan. The results were as shocking as the suspicions. All 5 had died from arsenic poisoning. Testimony from local shopkeepers revealed that Amy had been purchasing large amounts of arsenic, claiming it was for a rat infestation on the property. But the evidence didn't stop there. Investigators discovered that Amy had been convincing her patients and even their family members to buy arsenic themselves, under the guise of it being used for medical treatments. In a grotesque twist, her victims had knowingly provided the very poison used to kill them. The unraveling of Amy's schemes didn't end with the poisonings. Closer scrutiny revealed that the will Michael Gilligan had signed just months after marrying Amy was a forgery, created by Amy to ensure that she inherited his entire estate. The Murder Factory was no longer a whispered suspicion. It was a gruesome reality, meticulously orchestrated by its caretaker. By the time Amy Archer-Gilligan faced trial, her carefully constructed life had crumbled. A jury found her guilty of murder, and she was sentenced to death. But the story didn't end there. Amy appealed her conviction, earning a retrial where she changed her plea to not guilty by reason of insanity. This time, the court spared her life, sentencing her instead to a life in prison. After serving several years behind bars, she was transferred to a mental hospital where she would remain for the rest of her days. Amy died in 1962, confined within the same walls that housed 2 of her siblings, both suffering from mental illness. Her legacy was no longer one of benevolence or care, but of betrayal, greed, and chilling murder. Justice had finally caught up with the woman behind the Murder Factory. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. And a fun fact about the podcast, the Murder Factory is a name that I considered calling this podcast. It was on the short list. It wasn't toward the top, but I liked the name, and it was before I thought of the concept of 10-Minute Murder. I thought about making a podcast in the before times. I started it during the pandemic times. But I had the list of things that I thought maybe I would want to do on a podcast, and the Murder Factory was on that list. I'm glad I didn't use it now because, it is a good name, I think. It's a good name for a podcast, but I think that I most definitely more align with the 10-minute murder type of vibe. As we all know, there are times when I can't focus for an hour or 2 hours to listen to a podcast, or it just flat out puts me to sleep. So 10 minutes seem like the ideal amount of time that I can tell a story and get all the facts in that are relevant and the details that are interesting and make the whole podcast. But Murder Factory is kind of a cool name. So hey, if you're a new listener to 10-Minute Murder, make sure you hit subscribe wherever you're listening right now. Follow me on social media, links are in the show notes, or you can go to 10minutemurder.com and find all the information about the podcast there, 10minutemurder.com. And that's going to do it. That's your episode for today. Thank you so much for listening.